So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Carol Dickenson, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic here at QUT. Thank you.
Oh, good morning, everybody. It's good to see some familiar faces, but also some new faces. I would actually like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal, Juggera, Gubbi Gubbi and Jinnaburra people, who are the traditional owners of the land where QUT now stands, and to recognise that these have always been places of learning and teaching. I'd also like to acknowledge the role that our Indigenous elders, past, present and future, have played at QUT and continue to play in such an important way with us. On behalf of the University and our Vice-Chancellor Peter Coldrake, I would like to welcome you to QUT and also to your forum that you are having here today. Unfortunately, Peter is travelling on university business, sends his apologies, but does hope that the forum is a successful one for you. I'm also delighted to welcome you here to what we call P Block. It's imaginative, isn't it? P Block. But it is our new Science and Engineering Centre. It's headquarters of our Institute for Future Environments, and it's home to our awe-inspiring Cube, which I hope you have the opportunity to go and look at. It is an interactive digital space. This building has changed the way that teaching and learning and research is being done at QUT, so is very relevant to you as part of your forum here today. But it is also enables us to think in a more, I suppose, cutting-edge way about how we undertake teaching and learning and research, and how we can actually utilise these kind of facilities to the extent that they do provide us. And I'm sure as you move around the building, if you get that opportunity, you will see the many aspects of it that fall right into your areas of interest. We're very proud to be hosting your open forum, and as I understand it, this was established in 2011 with the support of the Australian Government Office of Learning and Teaching. Suzi's here, thank you. And I think you have grown now to have about 70 scholars who have been well placed, both geographically, institutionally, and within the discipline communities that promote effective learning and teaching. The fellowship program advances learning and teaching in higher education by supporting this group of leading educators and to undertake strategic and high-profile activities in areas of importance to the sector. And I would like to emphasise that is actually of importance to the whole sector, not just to your own institutions or to you personally. And there's been some wonderful work that's being done and continues to be done that many of us look to for our future. The forum theme, Professionalising the Academic Workforce, that's not contentious, is it? I mean, that's fairly straightforward. I'm sure you're all going to agree with how that should be done. It is, though, something of great significance and importance to us. And I guess you can think about that in different ways. Certainly here at QUT, we have a project underway at the moment that is looking to identify the future capabilities of people involved in academic work. And notice I didn't say the academic workforce. Because there are a lot of people involved in academic work, and we need to think broadly about what that means and what capabilities those folk need as we move into the future. So we finished the first phase of that, which is to identify the trends of changes in academic work, and we're moving now into the next phase of looking at our gaps, our capability gaps, both organisationally and for the workforce, as we think to the future about how academic work will be done. I'm sure every university in the country is thinking about aspects of that or exactly that as they look to do their own workforce planning, which hopefully they do. And a very significant part of that is how and should we professionalise the workforce. So the themes that you've got for the sessions today, I think are very interesting ones. I'm very interested to know the answer that the Vice-Chancellors give you later today about how many universities does Australia need. I'll really look forward to the answer to that question. I think they've changed the question a few times. So I think you've got some very good and relevant topics that are before you. So I would just like to thank you for coming here. We are very happy to have you here and to be host of your forum, and we look forward to hearing the outcomes of the discussions that you have. I would actually now like to invite Professor Suzi Vaughan to come and give what I believe is the keynote address. Suzi, she's going to tell us about professionalising academic workforce. Thank you.
Where's the keyboard? How do I escape? Oh, there we go. Oh, are you doing it? Are we being remotely controlled? Or did I just do a... There we go. I am actually someone who can operate their own PowerPoint, so that's... there we go. Let's close your eyes. Okay. All righty. Gosh, I feel like I was only here yesterday. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. And I am Suzi Vaughan, and I'm DVC Learning and Teaching at QUT. I was quite better behaved than the VCs, which was I kept the stem of the title for my... In fact, I think this was all Dawn gave me, Professionalising the Academic Workforce. And I changed or added the thing you always need is a colon and another phrase. So I've added the times, they are a-changing, and I won't set that to music, but you probably recognise the song from which it came. And this is a poison chalice. And I'm not sure it's the right metaphor, but you know how you agree to do these things and then the dates get closer, you start to work on what you're actually going to say and how you're going to use those 40 or so minutes ahead of you. And I've really struggled with this one. And I've struggled because I don't want to oversimplify this, but nor do I want to make it so complex that it seems hopeless. I really want, and I am going to talk about learning, but I don't want that to be seen as an idea that I don't value teaching or teachers. I'm going to talk about teams, but I don't want that to be seen as that I don't value individuals and the roles that individuals play. I'm going to talk a lot about change and the future. So I've really struggled to try and get that balance. And what I feel I have to do before I move on is just to talk about very, very quickly, and it's not to blow our trumpet here at QUT, but just to talk about some of the things that we're doing that many organisations and universities are doing to try and support and build capability in the academic workforce. So we have a very strong commitment to early career academics at QUT, and that's been something that's been in place for a number of years. 2 years ago, we moved up from our e-card programme to a graduate certificate in academic practice, and we purposely chose that name to bring together the different dimensions of academic work and not call it just teaching and separate that and put it in tension. We have built and consolidated the ways that we attempt as much as we can to support what are several thousand sessional staff through scaffolded opportunities for development and other things. And we've done a lot of work around things like evaluation of teaching. I'm not going to suggest we've got that right, but really to try and give agency and voice to academics to provide different sorts of more meaningful and contextualizable tools with which people can see the impact of what they are doing on the learning of their students. And there's lots of other examples. So I suppose what I want to say is there are lots of meaningful things that we can do right now to support and build capability. But I'm now going to move on and talk about some other things. So, you're meant to start and have a beginning and an end and a middle. So I'm going to attempt to work my way through these. And I'm going to start with the what. And that's an interesting one because these names are shifting. And I think that actually says something to where we are at in terms of the speed with which some of these conversations and the things that we are grappling with are emerging and changing, and the words that people are comfortable and not comfortable with. And I am going to speak a little bit about that because this project, when it started the ALT call, was around framing a national agenda for professionalising university teaching. along with the idea of a framework. It then sort of morphed into reconceptualizing the professional practice of teaching in higher education. And I think I'm right in saying that it's now sitting at the academic workforce of the future and the quality of Australian higher education. That's an interesting shift in language. And I know from being at Canberra a couple of weeks ago where one of these projects was spoken about, that one, if not the only reason, was that the word professionalising was, and I quote, a red rag to a bull in some quarters. Now, that's an interesting one, especially when you look up, as of course you do, the definition for professionalise, and I'm assuming, I might be wrong, I'm assuming that it wasn't anything to do with the first one here, which is about giving professional status to university teaching, because I don't think many people would complain about that as a notion. I'm thinking it might be this one, which I suppose alludes to the fact that if we talk about professionalising something, it means that what we're doing at the moment isn't professional. So I'm thinking that might have been the reason, but I'm going to talk a bit more about that too. I am unashamedly going to talk about learning, because I really do believe that learning needs to be at the heart of everything we do. And I don't just mean our students learning or learning outcomes, but learning professionally and learning as organisations. And that's not just the role of certain people within an organisation and not something that others need to worry about. So the why. Well, the nature of work and the workforce is changing. And that has been seen in lots of ways. I mean, we talk about the massification of higher education, but really what that comes from is an acknowledgement by more and more people that if they are going to have an opportunity to flourish in the future, then they need a qualification. And increasingly that kind of creep, and that they need not just one kind of exit qualification that they walk away merrily with at the age of 21, but that they are genuinely going to need to upskill and probably change careers many times. That's the truth. And it's not just happening out there, it's happening in here. So the nature of our work and our workforce is also changing. And I think this is an interesting one. So I did look up the term professional, but I think in fact this is what sits at the heart of some of this difficulty we have, which is that not just academics in universities, but academics principally, are a large part of why they're employed and continue to be employed, and a large part of what they hold as part of their role is to be expert in their discipline, to remain expert in their discipline, and to share that expertise in a range of different ways. And I think that's the rub, which is that sits at the core of what we feel is essential in our profession, and that is being challenged in all sorts of ways. Now, I'm not going to say which university this survey was done in, and I keep going back to this statement, so I'm just going to let you read it while I have a slug of water. Everyone got to the bottom, more or less. And it goes on. Sort of needs silence, doesn't it? Now that is just one response to one survey from one person, but I think it really says a lot about how actually many people feel about these amplified expectations now. And it's not just about becoming professional at something that you can then continue to do in more or less the same way. I think what has really generated so much conversation at the moment is that just becoming good enough at what I am doing here, lecturing, is not actually enough. And our expectations around people in this part of their work are really, really stepping up. at the same time that many of our workload models, and you know, I don't want to hear how long it takes, are really not actually recognising what we're asking for. So I think it's a very useful, it's very, as my Vice-Chancellor would say, therapeutic quote, that one. On the other hand, this is a transformer. I think, and if you can read, I'm standing in front of this one, but you know, excellent world-class researcher, income generator, ideally competitive income, excellent engaging teacher and supervisor, curriculum designer, community engaged, internally and externally, techno-savvy, efficient, effective administrator, leader, collaborator. I stopped at that point. That's how we talk about academic staff, that they should be all of these things, all of the time. And I think that's quite a stretch. That's quite a stretch to achieve that. But to sustain that for any length of time, as an individual and as all of our individuals doing all of those things to excellence, I think is another reason why we really need to think about what we're doing and who does what. And this is some sort of grasshopper. But I suppose the thing is this idea, and again, it was very interesting in Canberra, that implicitly and then more and more explicitly in the room as we talked about professionalising the academic workforce, what we realised was we were only talking about actually quite a small part of the academic workforce, which were tenured, ongoing academics, and that we were talking sort of about this I would suggest, increasingly rare standard academic who's 40% teaching and 40% research, and 20% actually stands for engagement, not administration. And I'm just not sure if it's useful for us to continue to focus on that rare breed. Because in truth already, although of course there are ongoing 40-40-20 academics in the picture, in terms of our students' learning experiences, there are many, many other people. Sessionals that come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and bring all sorts of contributions. Practicum, all sorts of people, certainly at QUT, who teach and support the learning of our students outside of the walls of this organisation, but in formal environments, as well as, dare I suggest, all of those other people who support learning in different ways. And they are all around our institutions and are part of our students' learning experiences. So that's one set of whys. The second set of whys is that I think the learning needs of individuals and organisations are changing. And again, that's both out there and in here. This notion that our students are full-time, either full-time students or actually full-time students. I mean, we don't actually offer many part-time undergraduate degrees at QUT, but the majority of our students actually consume our degrees in a part-time mode. And we still talk about them as full-time, and we talk about them as full-time students, when of course we know that they are juggling, and for most of them, succeeding to juggle education with work and family and all sorts of other things. And the sorts of skills that our students, and I would suggest we need to learn, are these sorts of 21st century super skills. And we talk about this and we all know this. Creativity, innovation, invention, collaboration, working together, critical thinking, communication. These are the sorts of things that we know both our students and we need to learn. Now, actually, the longer the time goes since he had his moment, and I won't say in the sun, because that's an unfortunate one, but this was Al Gore, and you remember he did have a moment in the sun talking about climate crisis. And this, I hope you all know, is Ken Robinson. If you haven't ever seen his TED Talks, absolutely worth seeing. But Ken Robinson, who is does a lot of work with different governments around education, talks about a second climate crisis. He talks about a crisis of human resources. And he talks mainly about school-level education, but what he talks about is that we are still very invested in a model of education that was designed and worked quite well for a different time, and that was a time where manufacturing was the major employment, where we had a relatively small number of white-collar workers and a very large number of blue-collar workers. And that isn't what most of us do anymore. It's not what most of our students aspire to do or will go on to do. But our models of education, both at school and I would suggest at university, are really framed around quite artificial things. So at school, you're batched by age. And for us, we kind of batch people into units and courses that are, units are all the same length. 3 hours of this a week for all units, assessment somewhere, and at the end, as if everyone takes exactly the same time to learn that. And he talks about the need to move to what he describes as an agricultural model, where we think about the learning environments we create that better nurture the needs and the aspirations of students and learners. And let's face it, we've been talking about a paradigm shift from teaching to learning in higher education for decades. This is a favourite one that I found therapeutic. This is the work of Barr and Tagg from 1995. If you haven't ever read this paper, and I am going to refer to it again, it's magical. They talk about a shift from a teaching paradigm to a learning paradigm, and they talk about a whole range of frameworks, but the one is that shift from delivering to producing learning. And they use that word producing very intentionally, which is this learning isn't something that we move away from in terms of just leave them to it and they'll get on with it on their own. It's designed, it's curated, it's facilitated by experts, but it really is a shift. But if you think about much of what we've done, really, in that time, I would suggest that it's been more in the way of sustaining innovations. And this is a fantastic example, this very room we're in. Because if you think about that, and then you think about that, or this, it's a very similar pedagogy there, isn't it? I stand at the front, you sit there, largely passively. Hopefully you are still more or less engaged. I can see I've lost some already. There's probably, and in fact I haven't got my little flicker, but there's two talking up the back there. There's one gone to sleep. There are probably more girls in the picture on the right, and there's certainly a lot more technology. We've completely screwed the student-staff ratio, but really it's more or less the same. We've sustained and extended and improved a similar model. So change, well, we need to be ready and capable, and we'll just start with a bit about ready. And to be ready, the first thing about that is actually recognising the need to change. And I think many people actually do recognise that there's an opportunity and a need now to change. As you stare out, perhaps, I would suggest later, I'll be generous, later in semester, those empty seats, and there's maybe, I don't know, I'll be generous, 30% of the students there that should be there. Then I think people feel like, what am I doing? Because those students who aren't there aren't failing. And when you hear comments like this is a student, this was a comment that Judy Stocker from our library shared with us. I don't go to the library or lectures, I get bored and distracted, I still get 6s and 7s. This isn't a student who's failing, this is a student who is excelling. So I think we have a problem. And actually, you know, Mark, I did manage to get that quote in from yesterday. The future isn't what it used to be. Don't you love that? Brad Haseman shared that with us yesterday, and I struggled to find a place for that. So the when. Well, I think the when is now, and there's lots and lots, you know, I could have pulled on 28 doom and despair reports that have come out over the last few months about the imminent demise of universities, and I don't agree with any of that, but I do think that we need to seize this attention that is being given to really think about how we take that as an opportunity, because the real world is changing and we do need to change with it. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about one of those changes, and here for a bit of light relief, just in case you don't know who that is. That's me. There's me. I was a first-year fashion student. Some of you have seen this, but others haven't. I was, yes, quite in love with Boy George. I still can't hear comma, chameleon without breaking into a cold sweat. But anyhow, there I was, fresh into first-year fashion. And I remember a lecture, so it must have been a good lecture, where they talked about fashion and technology, and not the impact of technology on how we make clothes, but the thrust of the lecture was that, I can't really say this without laughing now, but the thrust of the lecture was that technology was going to set us free. And what that meant in the 80s was that we were going to have so much leisure time. I know, so went the other way. that we would be working a few hours a week, and in between we would be dressed sort of like that. That was the promise. So what we were thinking of as fashion designers is, oh my goodness, we'll all be in tracksuits and, you know, leisure wear. Anyhow, that didn't happen. And he might have agreed, but thankfully we're not dressed in burgundy, or maroon, as I've now learned to call that colour. But the reality, and certainly for our work, is that it feels more complex, more demanding. I love that, don't you love that? That it's accelerated, that the expectations of us in all the dimensions of our work are more and more complex and demanding, and overwhelming at times. And certainly, I don't know about you, but I haven't broken out my tracksuit yet. It's firmly in its wrapping, and I'm quite busy, and I see a lot of busy people around me. So in terms of disruptive innovation, I actually am not representing this as a piece of disruptive innovation, except that it's got people talking. I don't think the model of MOOCs is madly disruptive. That's disruptive. There's a bit of disruptive technology. So I don't think that in themselves MOOCs are disruptive, but they've got people's attention. They've got Vice-Chancellor's attention. They've got a number of people's attention. And I think, again, we need to seize that moment. There it is again. And if you know the work of someone like Diane Oblinger, yes, information is now freely available. And that's challenging enough in itself. But what she speaks about as the greater promise and the greater thing that is disruptive is the way that we are now able to connect both to information but to others within and beyond the room, to other experts, to other learners, anywhere in the world. And I don't think that we are maximising anywhere near the opportunities to really think about what that means for us as we go forward around connected, collaborative, social learning, about models of hybrid and blended. And by that I don't mean that we're going to just close the doors on all of our campuses and just let them at it in a completely online environment. But I do think that how we engage with our learners needs to change. And this is another therapeutic thing. We asked some students recently to draw for us their learning ecologies, thinking that we might actually need to do quite a bit of work on explaining, but no, they had the felt tips in their hands already, and off they went. And this is quite representative of what those students said. So here, I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. You're probably looking for where lecturers are. They're down there. But peers, number one, both face-to-face and in online, but peers were, for this student, and this is quite representative, workshops and tutorials over here, number two. Lecturers come in somewhere between offline and online resources. But this is what I think is particularly interesting. What this student does is that when she enrolls in a unit, one of the first things she does is really understand what the learning outcomes are that are being that will be expected, looks at the assessment and what the assessment requirements are, looks around at the peers that she has enrolled in that class, you know, who's who in the zoo, and then either individually or with peers goes out and sources and curates the very best learning resources they can find anywhere in the world from any place. And as it says, soberingly, right down in that bottom corner, mainly actually from other universities. And this student has a grade point average of, I think, about 6.8. I'm looking at Shona. And yeah, about 6.8. And if you look at the way that students engage, and these spaces have been quite magical, particularly the informal spaces out there, and this space upstairs, which I don't care what anyone says, we did not think our students would find this space. This is meant to be the sort of hotel-style lobby, entrance to the research floors that sit above it. But the stairs go there and the lifts go there, and it's very wide and it's very comfortable, and our students are regularly to be found there, often actually watching lectures that are streaming live from this space probably, which is 2 flights of stairs downstairs. And I think that also says something that we can't ignore. So I think we probably are change ready, whether or not we're change capable. I think this is a wonderful quote. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And I think that willingness for us to say that the future is probably going to be different to the past, and that's an opportunity and not a threat, is something that we need to do. So the how, and I'm coming towards you now. Now, for those of you who have pens poised for the one simple thing that we need to do to achieve this, I'm going to disappoint you, because I think it's foolish to think there is some silver bullet that will achieve this. And I also think it's important that we don't think that this is just about, and I'll use the word professionalizing for want of a different word, professionalizing a particular group of people, and everyone else in universities can just go on about their job as they do, and whether that's to do with timetabling or anything else, that's all fine, and we'll just fix this bit of it, because I think it's going to take more than that. Now, I told you I loved Robert Barr and John Tagg. This is a wonderful, wonderful quote from that paper from 1995. The change that is required to address today's challenges is not vast or difficult or expensive. It's a small thing, but it's a small change that changes everything. Simply ask, how would we do things differently if we put learning first? Oh, then do it. Simple. Oh, simple. But I do think we keep losing that in our conversations. We need to put learning first. So I have added to the, it's like that word game where you change the title. I've now had my go. So if we have, this is the one that I think is currently in existence. I'm suggesting we change it to this. Learning 2020, reimagining universities to meet the learning needs of the future. That's my suggestion for a new title. Because I do think that we need to reimagine what the future of our universities look like. And I don't think that means that they'll all be fully online, and I don't think that means that there will, oh, there's too many double negatives in there. There will be a place for experts, but a different sort of mix and with different sorts of roles. So I think that means that we need to reimagine our practices, and I don't just mean our teaching practices or our academic practices, I mean as universities, how we think about things. So some of you might have done this. It's a bit of a stretching movement thing. Who in the room is wearing a watch? Arms really high, and have a little look around. Okay, so let's do it the other way around. Who in the room isn't wearing a watch? Ooh, did some of the same people put their hands up twice there? No, okay, so that's pretty good. And this is something that Ken Robinson does, it's not mine. And what he talks about is if you do that in a room that is full of even younger people than us, less and less of them tend to be wearing a watch. So those youthful ones of you there, that to put your hand up in the second one. And the reason he says that is really they're not that useful, actually. They only do one thing well. They often have that date on, but it's generally wrong, or it's too small to read. Mine had a light on to show me the time, but it broke. And the reason he shows that, and the reason I'm showing that, people are now checking whether they're, Abby, I saw you, whether the date's right. I saw you. Is that we need to challenge the things we take for granted, and that is really, really difficult because we take them for granted. And there is so much about how we do things and what we do and who does what and when they do it that we just take for granted. That if we don't start to have those conversations and are able to interrogate that, we just won't be able to change them. But let's be honest, when it comes to investing that time, that can be seen to be in tension with other things, perhaps. And I'll just move on. And I didn't say anything about that, you notice. But also that the sort of innovation, the opportunity that lies ahead of us requires different sorts of collaboration, different sorts of skills, different levels of preparation. And this does go back to that quote earlier about we were lecturers and now we're meant to be teachers. I still think we have this sense that individuals need to do all of this and be expert in all of this alone, many of them alone. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of suggestions of other industries that we might look to and a framework that I think is as good a place to start as any. This not working works much better when you see it than when you say it. When I encourage people to engage in not working, that might be seen as not a very good thing. But the idea of coming together, a sort of next generation communities of practice, which it actually brings people together in organisations, across organisational boundaries, around intentional shared work, I think is a really powerful way to think. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to think of universities as knowledge-based organisations. I would suggest that is exactly what we are like. But when you look at these, this is a great book, that workers in knowledge-based companies need to continue to learn throughout life. That's good. That's fine. That's not a deficit. It's not a criticism. It's the way that those jobs, our jobs, should be. And it goes on to talk about the need to be entrepreneurial. And you will see it then says, not necessarily in the skill of making money, but in the skill of seeing opportunities and doing what is necessary to make that happen. And again, I'm not just talking about academics needing to be entrepreneurial. I'm talking about all sorts of people in our institutions. And it goes on, and I'll just draw your attention to that last bit, that knowledge-based workers need to be creative and risk takers. And I would suggest that that's not been something that we have madly rewarded and recognised in people in the past. Perhaps quite the opposite. So the other industry that I think is worth looking at, and I'm not saying they've got it absolutely right, but I think there are some things that we could learn from, are the health industries and the way that within healthcare, around patients, different sorts of professionals, all of whom, I would suggest, though it might not feel like that to them, are recognised and skilled and have professional training. But they have a role to play as part of a team, and I'm guessing a lot of them aren't on 13-week contracts. But they have different roles, and as one of my colleagues said to me, well, I know who I'd rather have an injection from. Would it be the doctor who gets to do it once every maybe year, or the nurse who does 100 of them a week? I'm picking the nurse, thank you very much. But I think there are other industries that we can look to think about how we move forward. So what about frameworks? I hear you say. Well, I think there is one framework that exists, and it has been mentioned, and it will probably be mentioned today, and that is the HE Academy UK Professional Standards Framework. And that's not because I'm British originally, but I think for these reasons, I think it's a good place to start. They recognise the need for both initial and continuing professional development. And they recognise that need not just for people engaged in teaching, but for the people who I would say are still largely silent, who support learning in different ways. They talk about fostering dynamic approaches, they talk about creativity and innovation, and I think they're good things. They talk about the need, and I think this is important, to demonstrate to our students and to other stakeholders that we take what we do seriously, that we care about it, and that we try and do it as well as we can, and we will continue to. They also recognise diversity, the importance of context, of different ways of going about this, and they recognise that often, certainly currently, this part of someone's work is part of wider responsibilities. And I think for all of those reasons, this is a very good framework that we should look at. And I'm not getting any money to say that. That just felt like a bit of a, I'm not being paid to do that. So my very last slide is this. I think this is lovely. The future is not a result of choices among alternative paths offered by the present, but a place that is created first in the mind and will, and created next in activity. The future is not some place we are going to, but one we are creating. The paths to it are not found, but made, and the activity of making them changes both the maker and the destination. And that's my parting thought. Thank you. So I think I am actually under time. 15 minutes. Oh, Lordy, that leaves loads of time for questions. But I'm here. There we go. Brave one up the back.
Thanks, Suzi. Very engaging. I love the photos.
Boy, George.
Look kind of like I was interested in the comments about teaching and learning instead of teaching possibly, because the word pedagogy usually means the art of teaching.
I know.
But if you look at the origins of the word, which comes from, it's actually a German word, pedagogue, and the Germans don't separate teaching from learning. They see it as a relationship. So, as I said, the German interpretation of pedagogue is a dynamic relationship between teaching and learning. So, I'd just like you to comment on that, because I sometimes get a little bit concerned that about this almost dichotomy that's set up between teaching and learning, yet obviously a relationship is very effective if it's considered.
I totally agree, and I mean that's why one of the many reasons I like the bar and tag is they talk about producing learning. They don't talk about the idea that we'll all just step out of the way, we're redundant, you don't need teachers or experts, but that what our role is, how we produce learning is different. And this is a special group of people in that you are here. Not just to listen to me, obviously, but you're here because you care about this. Many of you have been recognised as leaders in what you do. But the truth is that the majority of people who teach have very little experience, a great deal to bring, don't get me wrong, but wouldn't know what pedagogy meant if they fell over it. And that's, don't get me wrong, because all of the indicators, and many of them are proxies, about the quality of what goes on at QT and other institutions is not that it's broken. Our students tell us that the majority of people who teach them do a pretty good job of that. But I just think as information becomes more freely available, as our students, as we have different options of how we access information, then what we do, how we use that expertise as teachers to think about how we connect to more than the one expert in the room is for many people a different, more extended way of having to think about their practice. So I'm not saying there isn't a place, it's just perhaps a different sort of role, and in concert with a number of different people.
Hello, Liz mentioned from the conversation. I was just wondering, you talked about reimagining universities, which is certainly something that we're trying to do with the conversation as a site. But do you have any examples that you want to point to at QT or elsewhere in Australia of a creative way of teaching that's really engaged students or got even the staff excited?
Can I go outside Australia? There are examples around the place. One, and I'm not sure I'm going to precisely, I'm not going to avoid your question, but I'm going to answer in a particular way. I think another thing that gets wrapped up in the sort of generic terms are the idea of our students. It's really easy to imagine for us, say that they're all school leavers, they're all full-time, they're all this, they're all that, and we know they're not. And again, but much of what we offer or deliver or sell is really designed for one sort of person. So I think some of the examples that are interesting and that certainly shift the focus around learning needs and outputs or outcomes are the Western Governor University in Australia that have really invented everything they do around achieving and evidencing learning outcomes, and that can be done at a different pace, and that's tipped everything that they've done to focus on that. And another one which may come and go, but is the University of Southern New Hampshire in the States, where they have and preserve a fairly small, elite, campus-based residential undergraduate program, which is very high cost, very sought after, and very high performing. But what they have done alongside that is to determine the needs of other sorts of learners. And one of the things that they did originally, which they thought would really solve the problem, was to accelerate that campus experience, thinking, well, that'll cost less, to be met with sort of cries of alarm from these students who had gone right through their school years, waiting for 3 or 4 years of everything that came with being on a campus, and didn't thank them very much at all for cutting that short. So they realised that that wasn't what needed in that space, but what they have realised is that there are many other learners, particularly mature, who are very time poor, or time jealous, I think was Stephen Billett's comment yesterday, who are actually getting lost in the system, who are not completing, and who have a real need, a pressing need to learn and extend their expertise and knowledge. And so they have created this thing called the College for America, which is completely separate to their campus-based residential education and is particularly designed with those learners and their learning in mind. And I think that those are some good models of really thinking in different ways about the different needs of different groups of learners. Choice? Oh, Helen.
Thank you very much, Suzi. That was wonderful. I'd like to focus on that concept of connectedness as well as the learning, and it builds on what you were just saying about how to connect with the people who are not necessarily on campus. But for 40 years, I've been emphasising the importance for staff of participating in workshops. It doesn't mean you have to give all your time, but the student who put up the workshops tutorials as number 2 is spot on. And it's not just for student learning, because this is how staff learn. This is how you learn about helping students learn. And I did some research in which I asked everybody from tutors to professors, young and old, to focus on how they learnt, how they thought they learnt to teach. And they all said by participating with students, and in fact a group of tutors, I finally had to sort of force them, and they finally said, how could you possibly be a lecturer if you haven't been a tutor first? So my first question is, how do we get the importance of participating in workshops, tutorials, not just for students but for staff? My second question is that unfortunately I've seen backsliding in the last few years. The emphasis on research has not just been on the emphasis on the time for staff, but on training students for research. So that, and this has actually increased the top-down drip feed, you must follow this line, rather than letting students do things and observing what they do. How do we put the emphasis on the importance of workshops for staff and students, and the importance of students' creativity does not mean dictating from a research point of view?
Ooh, thank you, Helen. No, it's all right. Well, number one, I'll have a go at number one first. I mean, this space is a good example of one that's been built fairly recently, but in a lightweight way so that it can actually be taken out pretty quickly. And I think our hope is that we can take it out pretty quickly. I think the importance, I mean, I come from a studio culture background, and that's not immune to students being time poor and making decisions about what they spend their time on. But that engagement that you see when workshop activities are really well designed and work, when students are truly engaged. And I mean, our new science degree is a great example of something that was reconfigured to really place a focus around collaborative learning and about bringing students together and academics and teams of academics, that's the other thing, teams of academics working within units so that they were engaging in conversations together and they were part of that collaborative teaching team, as well as being right in the thick of that learning. And that was very challenging for people, but I think what we've seen is that it's incredibly rewarding, that more and more people want to get involved in that, but it involves different skills. I mean, you know, this lecture, because that's what it was actually only about 30 minutes long in the end. That took me hours and hours and hours to design, but it was in my own time, and I got to speak at you, and you got to sit there, and fortunately I finished too early, so you've got lots of questions. But it's a different sort of preparation, it's a different sort of activity. And I absolutely agree with you. And I think one of the things might be that we think about if information is freely accessible, but even if you want to lecture or have content that you feel you are the only person in the world can pull together in a certain way and say, then we can do that in different ways now. We can make that accessible in different ways, and we can free up how we use our face-to-face time to bring students and people together in much more meaningful and engaging ways. And I think that's really important. And the research one, you know, it's not going away. I mean, I really, really recognise that tension. I truly do. And I think it's a real challenge. You know, most of our income comes from our students. You know, I mean, so I'm not talking about them as well, I am in this instance talking about them as a revenue stream, but we need to protect that revenue stream, and we need to deliver on the promise that we make our students. And there's a cost. And I mean, my answer for that really is I think that we need to start to think about whether the reality of everyone being a transformer and the usefulness of everyone being a transformer is the way forward. But in that sense, we then have to reward and recognise other things. And one of the things I didn't speak about at the beginning that we really went out of our way to do here was to try and bust some of the myths about what counts and what doesn't count and what will get you promoted and what won't get you promoted, to show that in fact over the last 5 years at QUT, there's been an absolutely equal success rate amongst people going forward with teaching weighted highly and research weighted highly. And that's the truth. That is actually the practice. But that is not the perception. It's not the message that people get. And I think we also have to describe, model those other ways of being as academics that provide people with different paths. There's more hands coming. I am going to come back at morning break, just in case we do run out of time.
Hi Suzi, Julie McCredden from the University of Queensland. I've worked as an educational designer and researcher in social and behavioural sciences and engineering for the last 4 years. So because this is a high-level forum, I'd like to talk at the high level about what we can do to professionalise the workforce. So there is a big issue of governance, and to get people to be creative and to get people to be promoted at the same rate as they get promoted for research, they have to do 10 times as much work and 10 times as much creativity. And part of that is because of the governance structures in higher education. There is really no governance structure for supporting teaching and learning. We have a governance structure for supporting research and another one that's called academic, which is actually mostly administration. It's about university exams and marks and the administration of those, and perhaps evaluating teaching by using CCATs or similar. But as far as being able to bring all the structures together that are needed to support a lecturer, that is timetabling, room bookings, all of those little everyday things, technology, there is no governance structure. And you have various personalities stepping into that void and filling it, and people taking risks and getting slapped for it often. We heard from Belinda Tynan at UQ recently. She came from the UK. She's in charge of learning analytics for the Open University. And she presented to us a wonderful framework of how it works for the Open University in the UK. And it's because they do have a third stream of promotion, which is for teaching and learning. And it's a quite radical thought that we could do that inside of higher education, that we could develop a proper third stream with a proper governance structure for teaching and learning, so that people can get promoted fairly without killing themselves and burning their family in order to become promoted for teaching and learning, and also have all the supports. There'd be decision makers who could actually say, yes, timetabling has to pay attention to our high profile flipped classrooms and give them the spaces they need, etc.
Do I want to talk about promotion or timetabling? Just in terms of the third stream, I mean, you're talking about your experience at UQ in terms of promotion. Are you or not? Are you making a statement about the way it is in the sector? For here? Okay. Because at QUT if you can go for promotion, level B to C, C to D, D to E, as a teaching intensive, you can choose your weightings either across research, teaching and service, and some people even put fractions in, they're probably from maths, to weight, not based on your workload, but to multiply the effect of where your strengths lie. And you can choose to go for teaching right through to level E. And I have been on that promotion panel for the last 3 years, and I have seen people promoted right through to level B at QUT based on the quality and increasingly the leadership of their teaching. So those frameworks can exist. It's about the practices and sometimes the perceptions about whether or not that is actually applied. The timetabling to me is like car parking was to our Vice-Chancellor, I think. But I agree with you, and I sometimes, I don't get my hand slapped. Well, I do sometimes. Is that the nature, again, even of someone like my role, which is learning and teaching, should perhaps just focus on curriculum and those sorts of things, and not concern myself around things that are other people's business, like timetabling is a good example. And that's exactly why I spoke about the need for us to think in bigger ways. Because that idea that, well, it's very complicated and that we have to organise all of these activities so that we really don't have much choice, it's just, it's not true. It's just comfortable. And we know we can do it, and you can't change it a bit. That's the problem, because believe me, we've tried a few little things into how do you can't suddenly change it a bit. You need to be able to really think about that in quite a dramatic way. And you do need to build different relationships. And I would say here, and it's that one of the strengths about QUT is that we know, and I know who does timetabling, I'm now looking at Shiona in my team, but we have those conversations about environments and timetables because you can't avoid them, you can't park them over there. And that's exactly why I don't think this is just about professionalising a certain group of people. And then I had a square peg and a round hole slide, which was really lovely, and I couldn't find quite where it fitted, but it fitted here. You know, you can't reimagine certain things and then keep ramming them into a little round hole. Well, you can if you chip all the bits off, but that wears you down, literally. So I do think we need to reimagine those things, and that's a big job. So I think probably I'm out of time now, aren't I? But I will be coming back at 11 for coffee, and I don't want to eat into the next session. Thank you.